cop laughed in a little black girl's face, calling her story a fairy tale, until the doors opened, and the truth walked in wearing a uniform that silenced the entire store. Amaya Richardson was 12 years old, standing in the sneaker aisle of Dick's Sporting Goods at South Park Mall. The shelves stretched high with rows of boxes, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. She leaned against the display with an ease that only kids had, talking to her best friend Kane about school, teachers, and which pair of Nikes she wished she could convince her mom to buy. It was the kind of ordinary Saturday conversation that didn't mean anything until suddenly it did. Kane teased her about how long her mom always took to pick her up. Amaya shrugged and replied without a second thought, "She's at Fort Bragg. Her schedule's crazy when she's with Special Forces." She said it casually, the way she might have mentioned her favorite cereal, her voice carrying the kind of natural pride that slips out when you love someone. Kane blinked at her wide-eyed. "Wait, your mom's in the army, like really fighting?" Amaya smiled and nodded. "Yeah, Sergeant Major Nicole Richardson. She just got back from overseas." It could have ended there, just a little boast kids toss around, one friend impressed and the other basking in it. But before the moment could settle, a sound cut through the aisle, a laugh, not the kind that warms a room but the kind that slices it. At first, Amaya thought she misheard. The laugh was short, almost like someone choking on a joke they weren't supposed to tell out loud. She turned her head and saw a man standing a few feet away, flipping through a rack of hoodies. Jeans, Carolina Panthers t-shirt, badge clipped to his belt like an accessory. Officer Colton Reeves, off-duty, relaxed, but carrying himself with that casual authority of someone used to being listened to. His shoulders shook slightly as he chuckled, eyes still on the rack. The laugh lingered in the air, sharp, dismissive, and Amaya felt her words stick in her throat. Reeves finally glanced over, his grin spreading. "Special Forces," he said, voice tinged with disbelief. "Come on, kid." Kane stiffened, looking between Amaya and the man. Amaya's stomach flipped. She hadn't been trying to prove anything. She was just talking to her friend. But suddenly, it felt like the floor had tilted, like everyone in the store could hear. Reeves stepped closer to the aisle, not aggressive, but deliberate enough that two women browsing socks paused, pretending to look at the shelves while stealing glances. "Special Forces," he repeated with a shake of his head, louder this time, his tone growing more amused. "I've been in law enforcement 20 years, and I can tell you right now, there's no way your mom's running with the Green Berets." He tilted his head, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Especially not someone like her." The words stung before Amaya even understood why. The way he said them made her cheeks flush hot. Kane leaned closer, whispering, "Just ignore him." But ignoring wasn't an option. Reeves had already made sure of that. The laugh that started as a half-choke had turned into something deliberate, meant for others to hear. A laugh that said, "I know better, and you're ridiculous for even speaking." Amaya's hands tightened around the shoebox she was holding. She hadn't expected to be tested, not here in front of rows of sneakers and strangers. She wanted to tell him to stop, to explain who her mother was, to remind him that the medals in the living room weren't fairy tales. But her mouth felt dry, and before she could form a word, Reeves chuckled again, louder, as though he had all the time in the world. That single laugh shifted the atmosphere. A moment ago, it was just two kids talking about shoes. Now it was something else. Something heavier. Shoppers began to glance over, curious, uncertain. A mother with a toddler slowed her cart, pretending to check price tags. Two teenagers nudged each other near the jerseys, whispering. Amaya could feel the heat crawling up her neck. What started as a casual boast about her mom had been yanked out into the open, twisted into a spectacle. The laugh had done that. And with it, the first crack in the air widened, hinting at the storm that was only beginning to gather. Reeves leaned against the rack as if settling in for entertainment, his grin fixed. "You know," he said loudly enough for half the aisle to hear, "kids like to make up stories. My son used to tell people I was Spider-Man, cute stuff, but not real." The words dropped like stones, and his chuckle followed, sharp and deliberate. Amaya felt the shoebox wobble in her hands. It wasn't just the man's disbelief, it was the way he broadcast it, inviting others to notice. And they did. A woman with a toddler in her cart slowed, fiddling with a pack of socks she'd already glanced at 3 times. Two teenagers by the hoodies leaned in close, whispering into each other's ears. A man in a baseball cap tilted his head, pretending to check a price tag while his eyes never left Amaya. The air shifted, the comfortable hum of shopping replaced with a quiet electricity. Reeves shook his head again, the smile on his face widening. "Special Forces," he repeated, savoring the words. "That's a good one. I mean, let's be honest, sweetheart, that's a fairy tale." He let the phrase linger, the syllables stretched just enough to sting. Amaya's throat tightened. Fairy tale. The word rang in her ears louder than the music drifting from overhead speakers. She thought of her mom's boots lined up by the door, the shadow box of medals on the wall, the nights when her mom's voice was only ink on paper because phones weren't safe. None of it was pretend. But standing here under harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by strangers, she had no way to prove it. Reeves chuckled again, more confidently now, sensing the crowd's attention. He tapped the badge clipped to his belt, a casual gesture, as though his 20 years in uniform gave him authority to decide what was true and what wasn't. "Look," he said, addressing not just Amaya, but the shoppers who had stopped pretending to browse. "There's nothing wrong with wanting your mom to be a hero. Every kid wants that, but you don't have to invent myths to get there." His voice carried like an announcement, his laugh the punctuation. Kane shifted nervously beside Amaya, whispering, "Just let it go." But Amaya's chest was burning. Let it go meant letting him win. She wanted to shout that her mom wasn't a myth. She was real, flesh and blood, tougher than anyone in this store. She wanted to scream that her mother had led soldiers, risked her life, done things Reeves couldn't imagine. But the words jammed in her throat, tangled by the weight of every eye on her. Around her the crowd thickened. The woman with the toddler lingered longer than she needed to, the teenagers now smirking as they whispered. Even people at the end of the aisle angled themselves just enough to catch the show. No one spoke up. No one said, "She's telling the truth." The silence was worse than Reeves's laugh. It made his version feel like the only one that mattered. Amaya's face burned. Her lips pressed tight. She could feel the shoebox trembling in her hands, the cardboard scraping her palms. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the rows of sneakers, but something inside her refused. It wasn't pride exactly, not yet, but a stubborn seed of defiance. She swallowed hard and managed, barely above a whisper, "It's true." Reeves laughed again, his voice booming this time, bouncing off the racks of jerseys and shelves of backpacks. "Fairy tales," he said once more, shaking his head as if it were the funniest thing he'd heard all week. His eyes swept the small circle of onlookers, inviting them to laugh with him. And some of them did, quietly, nervously, but enough. The isolation wrapped around Amaya like a net, pulling tighter with every glance, every whisper. What had started as a simple brag to her best friend had become a stage she never asked for. And Reeves was the MC, turning her truth into a public punchline. The aisle felt brighter than it had minutes ago, every flicker of the fluorescent lights pressing down like a spotlight. Reeves folded his arms, the smirk on his face wide enough to draw the attention of anyone within earshot. "You know what this reminds me of," he said, loud enough for his words to travel across the shelves. "When my boy was little, he used to run around telling people I was Spider-Man. Cute story, made people smile, but everyone knew it wasn't real." He let the comparison hang for a moment before laughing, a deep, mocking laugh that carried far beyond the sneaker displays. The sound wasn't warm. It was sharp, meant to cut. Amaya's stomach knotted so tightly she thought she might be sick. Her cheeks burned as if every person in the store was staring at her. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the polished tile floor, but her feet stayed planted, heavy as stone. Kane tugged lightly at her sleeve, whispering, "Please, just let it go." But Amaya couldn't, not because she felt brave, but because if she said nothing, his laughter would be the only story anyone remembered. Her throat tightened as she forced the words out, trembling but firm enough to be heard. "You'll see." 3 small syllables, thin as paper, but they sliced the laughter for a fraction of a second. Reeves cocked his head, eyebrows raised, then laughed again, even louder this time, as though her attempt to defend her mother had only made the joke better. The crowd responded in kind. A couple of teenagers near the jerseys snickered behind their hands. The woman with the toddler shook her head with a pitying smile, and then, almost casually, a phone was raised. A teenage boy angled it toward Amaya and Reeves, pretending to scroll, but the red recording light betrayed him. Another followed. 2 glowing screens pointed at her like spotlights, capturing every tremble of her hands, every flicker of fear across her face. Amaya's heart pounded so hard she felt it in her ears. The shoebox slipped from her grip and landed back on the shelf with a thud, louder than she meant. The cardboard scrape echoed in her head like a mistake. She clenched her fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms, willing herself not to cry. "You'll see," she repeated, but her voice cracked this time. Reeves leaned in just slightly, enough to make it feel personal, but not so close that anyone could accuse him of crossing a line. "Oh, I'll see her. Sure, sweetheart. Maybe she'll swing in on a web next." His words earned another ripple of chuckles from the onlookers. The teenagers weren't even hiding their amusement anymore. One nudged his friend, whispering something that made them both laugh under their breath. The humiliation pressed against Amaya like a weight on her chest. Not only his words, not only his laugh, but the eyes, the smirks, the glowing phones. Every detail layered on top of the next, until it was hard to breathe. She wished she could explain, wished she could talk about the nights she cried herself to sleep when her mother was away, the medals framed in their living room, the way people stepped aside for her mother in airports without even knowing who she was. But the truth was locked inside her, and Reeves's voice was louder than anything she could summon. Kane's hand found hers, but even that small comfort felt fragile under the weight of all those eyes. Reeves tilted his head back, enjoying the moment, his laughter echoing one more time as he looked around the store like a performer waiting for applause. Fairy tales, he said again, dragging the words out slowly. Kids love them. Adults laugh at them. That's the way of the world. Amaya swallowed hard, blinking fast, fighting the tears that threatened to spill. You'll see, she whispered again, but this time the words sounded less like defiance and more like a prayer. And Reeves's smirk told her that to him. It was nothing more than another punchline. The music that had been playing faintly over the store's speakers seemed to vanish, swallowed by the silence pressing in from every side. It was as if the entire aisle had shifted into a stage, with Amaya under the harsh fluorescent lights, her every breath magnified. Reeves leaned back against the rack of hoodies, crossing his arms, his smirk steady. Tell you what, he said, voice dripping with amusement. If your mom walks in here right now in full uniform, I'll buy you those sneakers myself. But until then, maybe save the fairy tales for bedtime. His words landed with a cruel finality, like the slam of a gavel. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Someone whispered, she made it up. Another voice added, poor kid lying just to feel special. The whispers weren't loud, but they were sharp, each one slicing deeper than Reeves's laugh had. Amaya's throat burned. She wanted to shout that they were wrong, that her mom was real, stronger than anyone they could imagine, but the weight of their stares pinned her down. Her sneakers felt glued to the linoleum floor. Kane tugged at her sleeve again, more urgently this time. Amaya, let's just go, we don't have to stay here. Her friend's voice was soft, but it carried the desperation of someone who wanted to protect her. Amaya looked at the exit, just a few aisles away, but her body refused to move. To leave now would feel like surrender, like proving Reeves right. Her chest heaved as she tried to hold herself together, but every second stretched longer than the last. Reeves tilted his head, eyes scanning the growing circle of onlookers as if daring them to challenge him. None did. Their silence was an answer of its own. He chuckled again, shaking his head slowly, savoring her discomfort. Didn't think so, he said. Kids always think their parents are superheroes, but this is the kind of story that gets laughs, not respect. The humiliation pressed down heavier than before. Amaya clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms until it hurt, but even pain couldn't anchor her against the tide of doubt rising inside. For the first time, she wondered if speaking up at all had been a mistake. Maybe she should have kept her mom's job private, like her mom always asked. Maybe then she wouldn't be standing here with strangers judging her, their phones recording her shame. She felt small, smaller than she had ever felt, her voice trapped behind a lump in her throat. Kane whispered again, please, let's go, but Amaya couldn't answer. She stared at the floor tiles, their gray squares blurring through her tears. The shoebox sat abandoned on the shelf beside her, its bright colors mocking her with promises she couldn't touch. Her chest tightened as the weight of every eye pressed harder, as though the whole world was waiting for her to break. This was no longer just about sneakers or small talk. It was about her truth, her pride, her mom, turned into a joke in front of people who didn't care enough to defend it. And as Reeves leaned back, looking smug and satisfied, it seemed certain that she had lost. Silence in the aisle had grown so thick it was hard to breathe. Amaya's fists trembled at her sides, her head bowed as if the floor might swallow her whole. Reeves leaned back, smug as ever, his voice carrying across the racks like he was the host of a comedy show. See, he said with a half laugh, gesturing around him as though the absence of proof sealed the deal. Nobody's coming. The words echoed in Amaya's chest, heavy and cruel. For a heartbeat she thought maybe he was right. Maybe this humiliation would never end. Then, faintly at first, there was another sound, steady, deliberate, out of rhythm with the chatter of the food court just beyond the sliding glass doors, boots striking tile, a cadence that didn't rush, didn't falter, just commanded space with every step. Amaya's head snapped up, her breath caught. Reeves smirked wider, misreading her reaction. What, expecting a superhero to drop from the ceiling? He teased. But the sound of those boots grew louder, closer, until the sliding doors hissed open. Conversations in the distance hushed for reasons no one could quite name, and then she appeared. Sergeant Major Nicole Richardson stepped through the entrance with a presence that needed no announcement. Camouflage uniform pressed sharp, insignia catching the light, beret tucked under one arm. Her posture was so precise, so steady, that even strangers instinctively stepped aside to clear her path. The hum of the mall seemed to fade, replaced by the unmistakable rhythm of authority walking straight into the sporting goods store. Amaya's lips parted, her throat tightening not from fear this time, but from the swell of relief so sudden it made her eyes sting. She hadn't realized how badly she wanted to see her mother until this very second. Her chest ached with it, the kind of ache that comes when the nightmare finally cracks open and light pours in. Reeves straightened instinctively, his smirk faltering for just a fraction of a second as his eyes caught the gleam of her rank on her sleeve. He recovered quickly, forcing a grin, but it was thinner now, stretched across a face that no longer radiated the same unshakable confidence. The crowd fell silent, as if pulled by an invisible string. Phones lowered. Whispers died mid-sentence. All eyes shifted from the girl trembling by the sneakers to the woman, whose boots carried her, with unshaken certainty, toward the scene. Nicole's gaze scanned once across the racks of jerseys and backpacks, past the onlookers hovering in uneasy circles, before landing squarely on her daughter. Amaya's composure shattered. A single sob escaped, quiet but raw, and she covered her face for half a second before rushing a breath back in, trying to hold herself together. Tears welled anyway, sliding hot down her cheeks. But this time it wasn't humiliation. It was release. She had been carrying the weight of disbelief. The sting of laughter, the crushing silence of strangers. And now, in a single heartbeat, she wasn't carrying it alone. Nicole closed the space between them with steady steps, her expression unreadable but her presence undeniable. Kane's hand slipped from Amaya's arm, no longer pulling her away but instead retreating in awe. The woman everyone had doubted, the figure Reeves had marked into a punchline, was standing right there, flesh and blood, and stronger than the room had imagined. For the first time all afternoon, Amaya's chest lifted. The despair that had cemented her shoes to the floor cracked open. She exhaled a shuddering breath, her tears falling freely now, but with them came relief, pride, and something even greater. Justice had just walked into the aisle. Nicole stopped beside her daughter, one hand resting lightly on Amaya's trembling shoulder. The girl's tears streaked her cheeks, but she stood taller the moment her mother touched her, as if the weight pressing down on her had lifted just enough to breathe again. Reeves shifted, straightening his back, his smirk returning but not as easily as before. "Evening, ma'am," he said, forcing a politeness that didn't reach his eyes. Just clearing up a little misunderstanding. Nicole's gaze stayed steady, moving from Reeves to the circle of strangers watching, then back to him. Her voice was calm, even, but sharp enough to cut through the heavy silence. "A misunderstanding," she repeated. "My daughter says you told her I couldn't be who I am." Amaya's lips parted, her voice shaking but strong enough to carry. "He laughed, Mom. He said I made it up." The words cracked open the air again, heavier now with Nicole standing there. Reeves chuckled, but it sounded thinner than before. "Kids, you know how they are, big imaginations. I was just having a little fun with her." Nicole tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "Fun? You mocked my daughter in front of strangers and called her a liar." The man's shoulders stiffened. He held up his hands half defensively. "Now hold on, I didn't call her that. I just said she might have stretched the truth." Nicole's tone didn't rise, but it carried the weight of command. "Exaggerating is saying your mom makes the best cookies in the world. Exaggerating is telling your friends you can run faster than a car. My daughter told you the truth, and you laughed in her face." The crowd shifted, a murmur passing through them. Reeves cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "All right, maybe I shouldn't have laughed, but you've got to admit it's unusual." Nicole's eyes never left him. "Unusual doesn't mean impossible. It means you've never seen it. And maybe the problem is less about me being here and more about you never imagining I could be." For a moment, the words seemed to freeze the air. Reeves swallowed, looking around at the crowd that was no longer smiling at his jokes, but waiting to see how he would respond. He tried to stand his ground. "I never said anything about race, never said anything about women. You're putting words in my mouth." Nicole stepped forward, just one measured step. But it made Reeves shift back unconsciously. The circle of shoppers widened, creating an open space between them, a stage no one had asked for but everyone wanted to watch. Nicole's voice dropped slightly, forcing him to lean in if he wanted to hear clearly. "You didn't have to say it. Your laugh said it for you." The silence afterward was heavy, broken only by the sound of someone near the registers muttering, "She's right." Reeves licked his lips, searching for footing. "Fine. Maybe I came across wrong. But I didn't mean harm. Nicole raised an eyebrow, her expression steady as stone. Intent doesn't erase impact. She stood here while a grown man with a badge turned her truth into a punchline. Do you understand what that does to a child? Amaya's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't shame. It was pride, because her mother was saying everything she couldn't. Reeves's face flushed. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound was hollow, empty of the confidence he had carried minutes ago. Nicole didn't move closer, didn't raise her voice, but every word was iron. I have served my country for 22 years. I have led soldiers through terrain you will never see. I have made decisions that carried life and death. And yet the hardest battle I face is here, convincing people like you that my existence is not a joke. Reeves exhaled sharply, his bravado cracking. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. His hands fidgeted, arms folding across his chest like a shield. Around them, phones rose again, recording the moment. Nicole didn't glance at them. Her presence alone commanded the room. She looked directly at Reeves and said, "This isn't just about me. It's about what happens when someone decides their assumptions matter more than the truth. My daughter shouldn't have to defend who I am to strangers. She shouldn't stand here in tears because you couldn't imagine her words being real." The circle of sharpers shifted again, some nodding faintly, others glancing down with discomfort. The balance of power had tipped. Reeves, who only minutes earlier had been the center of attention, now looked smaller, his jokes evaporating in the weight of Nicole's calm authority. His voice came out softer, strained. "All right, point taken." Nicole's gaze stayed locked on him. "No, not yet." She took another step forward, and the crowd pulled back again, widening the circle, until it felt like the center of the store had turned into a courtroom. Reeves stood in the middle of it, sweating under the fluorescent lights, facing a judge he couldn't laugh away. This was no longer about a mother defending her daughter. It was about a soldier turning the humiliation of a child into a trial of truth. And in that trial, Reeves was losing ground with every breath. Reeves shifted uncomfortably, his arms folding across his chest like he could shield himself from the weight of 100 eyes. The smirk that had carried him through every laugh, every jab, was gone now, replaced by something tight around his mouth. He cleared his throat, forcing out words that sounded more like an escape than an admission. "All right, I was wrong. I'm sorry if I embarrassed your kid." His gaze flicked to Nicole, not once glancing at Amaya. The apology fell flat, lifeless, tossed out like spare change. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd didn't move. Phones hovered higher, their red lights glowing. Nicole's expression didn't shift, but her voice sharpened just enough to slice through his attempt. "No," she said, "that's not an apology." Reeves blinked, caught off guard. "I just said I was sorry." Nicole took a slow breath, the kind that steadied the entire room. "No, you tried to save face, but you never looked at her. You never acknowledged the child you humiliated." She turned slightly, her hand still resting on Amaya's shoulder. "If you want to apologize, you do it properly. You look at her. You look at my daughter." The crowd murmured, a ripple of agreement sweeping through the sharpers. Reeves swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He glanced at Amaya for the briefest second before his eyes darted back to Nicole. "Sorry, kid," he muttered quickly, as if checking a box. Nicole's brow arched, her silence louder than any shout. A teenager near the jerseys called out under his breath, "Do it right." A woman holding her phone angled higher, waiting. Nicole's voice cut again, steady and undeniable. "Try again." The demand hung heavy in the air. Reeves flushed red, sweat visible now at his temples. His shoulders sagged as if the weight of expectation pressed down on him. He turned fully toward Amaya this time, his voice louder, strained but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Amaya," he said, her name awkward on his tongue, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have laughed at you. I shouldn't have said what I said. You told the truth and I didn't believe you. That was wrong." Amaya's eyes shimmered, not with shame but with something different this time. Her chin lifted just slightly. She held his gaze, not shrinking back. For once, the power was hers. The silence that followed broke with a single clap from the back of the crowd. Another joined, then another. Within seconds, the aisle echoed with applause. It wasn't loud or chaotic, but steady, firm, the sound of strangers acknowledging what they had witnessed. Reeves shifted again, shrinking under the approval directed not at him, but at the girl he had tried to tear down. Nicole let the sound roll for a moment before raising her hand. The clapping quieted, though the energy lingered. Her voice carried through the space, strong and measured, every syllable landing like truth carved in stone. "This isn't about one man and one child," she said. "It's about how easy it is to dismiss someone when their story doesn't match what you expect. My daughter spoke the truth, and instead of listening, it was easier to laugh. How many times does that happen? How many children grow up believing their voices don't matter because someone with power decided to mock them instead of hear them? The crowd shifted uneasily. Some nodded, others lowered their eyes. A man near the registers muttered, "She's right," almost to himself. Nicole continued, her gaze sweeping across every face. Respect costs you nothing, but withholding it, that can scar someone for life. It can strip away pride, it can silence truth, it can make a child doubt themselves when they were never wrong to begin with. Her words sank deep, filling the aisle like water seeping into stone. Amaya stood straighter beside her, Kane clutching her hand now not in fear, but in awe. Reeves looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His voice was gone, his authority dismantled in the quiet power of Nicole's presence. Nicole's hand squeezed Amaya's shoulder gently, grounding her daughter in the moment. She looked down at her, and then back at the circle of strangers. "Courage isn't always about standing on a battlefield," she said softly, but her voice carried to every corner of the store. "Sometimes it's about standing tall when you want to shrink. Today my daughter showed more courage than most adults ever will. And I won't let that go unseen." Amaya's chest swelled, her tears drying as pride took their place. For the first time that day, she no longer felt like a small girl caught in someone else's ridicule. She felt seen. The shoppers absorbed Nicole's words in silence, some with guilt, some with admiration. A woman whispered, "Thank you for your service," but it wasn't just about the uniform. It was about the lesson unfolding in front of them. Nicole nodded once. Final and resolute. Reeves exhaled, his posture slumped, his presence diminished. Whatever power he had wielded with laughter had been shattered, replaced by a truth he could not outrun. And in that silence, heavy but cleansing, everyone in the store understood the weight of what they had witnessed. The applause faded slowly, like waves receding after a storm, but the energy in the store lingered. People still stood rooted in place, eyes following Nicole and her daughter as if unwilling to look away from what they had just witnessed. Phones lowered, whispers softened, but the weight of the moment clung to the air. Nicole gave a small nod to the crowd, not triumphant, not boastful, simply acknowledging that the lesson had been delivered. Then she turned, her boots striking the floor in a steady rhythm as she guided Amaya and Kane toward the exit. The circle of shoppers parted without a word, making way as though they understood they were in the presence of something larger than themselves. Amaya kept her eyes forward, but she felt every gaze on her, not with ridicule now, but with respect. It was a strange feeling to stand taller in the same aisle where minutes earlier she had wanted to vanish. The sliding glass doors came into view, their quiet hiss promising escape. Kane stayed close, still clutching Amaya's hand, her wide eyes darting between the mother and daughter beside her. When they finally stepped out into the brighter light of the mall, the noise of the food court rushed back in, but it felt muted compared to the storm they had left behind. For a few steps, none of them spoke. Then Amaya's voice broke the silence, soft and uncertain. "Mom," she whispered. "Did I make it worse?" Nicole stopped walking. She turned and knelt slightly so she was level with her daughter, her eyes steady and kind. "No, Amaya," she said, her voice firm but warm. "You made it better. You told the truth when it wasn't easy. That takes more courage than some adults ever learn." Amaya blinked, the sting of fresh tears rising, but this time they weren't from humiliation. They were from something deeper, something steadier. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll never be ashamed again. Not about you, not about the truth." Nicole smiled faintly and pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead, sealing the promise with a gesture stronger than any speech. They began walking again, the echo of Nicole's boots carrying them down the mall corridor. Behind them, a few shoppers had followed to the doorway, watching quietly, some with their phones lowered at their sides, others with hands clasped. As though they understood, they had witnessed more than a confrontation. They had seen a child's truth defended, and a crowd reminded that respect is not optional. Amaya squeezed Kane's hand, her steps lighter now, her back straighter. The shame that had weighed her down was gone, replaced with a pride that filled her chest. She knew people would talk about what happened, maybe even share the videos, but for the first time she didn't care. Let them see, let them know, because the truth didn't need anyone's permission. By the time they reached the parking lot, the mall noise fading behind them, Amaya climbed into the car with a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of defeat, but the calm of someone who had survived a trial and come out stronger. Nicole started the engine, glancing at her daughter in the rearview mirror. "You girls ready to head home?" she asked. Amaya met her mother's gaze in the reflection and smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. "Yeah," she said, her voice steady. "Let's go home." The mall disappeared behind them, but the lesson remained. carved into the air like a promise. For Amaya, it was the day she learned she would never again let anyone laugh her out of her own truth. For the crowd who had stood by, it was a reminder that respect costs nothing, but its absence can leave scars that last a lifetime. And for everyone who would later watch and listen, the message was clear. Never underestimate the weight of a child's voice, and never forget that courage can be as simple as refusing to bow when the world tells you to shrink. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.